Dunoon Community Radio, brought to you by the Observer Stationery and Craft Shop, 219 Argyle Street, Dunoon, at the traffic lights.
For over 60 years, Gleaner Oils have been providing a quality service from local depots throughout Scotland. We pride ourselves in knowing what our customers want of us and are equally proud in providing what is expected of us. Across the rural countryside, through villages and towns, and regardless of the weather, we will not let you down. Gleaner Oils and Fuels. Telephone free on 0800 833 534.
Sailing down the Clyde on the Waverley, a grand old boat is the Waverley. She'll take you down to Rossi and be back for tea, the way that you did when you were wee. The buskers played at the after end, the kind of tune.
Dunoon Community Radio, Just Talking. Recorded live for broadcast and heard here on Dunoon Community Radio, Just Talking.
Hello everybody, Neil Alexander here. This is episode 2 of the series Just Talking on the crucial issue of Dunoon ferries, which is a red hot issue in Dunoon and is about the scandal of the bathtubs and causing much despair and deep-heated genuine anger of the general public in Cowal and Dunoon because of the continual cancellations and lack of a lifeline service. That's what we have, a lifeline service in Dunoon area. This second episode covers the politicians, the MSPs and the public in the packed Borough Hall in the Dunoon Centre. So, cancellations every week, falling numbers in schools, missed hospital appointments. These are the continuous and continual things that are happening. Falling school rolls, over 40%, by the way. And Dunoon Grammar School, who produced people like John Smith, Brian Wilson, George Robertson, J.J. Mackay, brackets, Lord Arbrecknish, a Conservative House of Lords leader. Famous Bob McLaughlin, the Herald editor, and now gone down from 1,000 in 2008 down to 500 plus. Isn't that totally shocking? They'll be turning, these ex-politicians will be turning in their graves. And as I say, missing hospital appointments, a forest of for sale signs as people are scattering to get out as a collapsing population. No wonder the people of Dunoon are in one of deep despair and deep-seated anger. And now it's going to be back over to John Patterson, who will introduce the politicians. He is the chairman for this evening.
Alan Reid now will speaks on behalf of the Liberal Democrats, and Alan will address the issue of harbour charges.
Right, thanks, John, and I want to thank DG FAG for all the campaign work they've done over the last 8 years and also for organising the meeting tonight. I want to talk about the MVA report. That you've already heard, that was the last of the 3 reports produced on this route. In particular, the need for the 40-metre vessel size and the problem of the harbour dues at Burgh. Clearly, the service is unfit for purpose. That's to quote a Scottish Cabinet Minister from several years ago. It's clear that a reliable service is possible because we used to have one. The Streakers, in their day, less than one sailing in 200 was cancelled. It would be great to go back to those days. Previous speakers have already talked about the MVA report and how the marine experts that compiled that said that the new vessels must, and note the word must, they said the vessels must be greater than 40 metres in order to produce a reliable service. Now, that was 6 years ago. The Scottish Government has not acted on that recommendation. And a couple of months ago, local councillors, we all went to meet the new Minister, Paul Wheelhouse, at Holyrood. There he promised us new boats, but I pointed out to the Minister at that meeting that the MVA report had said the length must be 40 metres. At that point, one of the civil servants jumped in, shook his head, referred to the Audit Scotland report, and said, I don't think we can justify that cost. So that is very worrying. Now, again, I met the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse, when he came last week, and again I pointed out that the ferry vessel length must be 40 metres. He waffled on, and in a very unconvincing manner, he said that he would consider that. But clearly, he's going to get civil service advice to say it costs too much. So it's very worrying that we have to insist on 40 metres. The experts say 40 metres. We must insist on that. Now, as has been previously said, if you have a 40-metre vessel to carry passengers, you can cut costs by putting a car deck on it. Competition law prevents the Scottish Government from subsidising a vehicle service because that would be unfair competition to Western ferries. But competition law does allow the Scottish Government to subsidise a passenger service. And since the experts say it has to be 40 metres, then competition law allows the Scottish Government to subsidise 40-metre vessels. So they should go out to tender and invite tenders from operators. The MVA report says that could be done. However, the Scottish Government has put yet another hurdle in the way, and that's the harbour charges at Burgh. Because at Burgh, owned by the Scottish Government, there's a huge difference between the charges for a vehicle ferry and for a passenger ferry. And that clearly acts as a big disincentive for any operator to carry vehicles rather than just passengers. That discrepancy used to happen at Dunoon, but the Council acted on the MVA report and has changed the harbour charges at Dunoon so that there's now only a small difference between the charges for a vehicle and a passenger. The Council can make these changes. There's nothing to stop the Scottish Government doing the same at Burgh. Now, there's absolutely no justification for these high vehicle charges at Burgh. The link span at Burgh is needed because it's the port of refuge for the Bute and Arn car ferries in bad weather. So whether there's a vehicle ferry service coming to Dunoon or not, that link span will be there, it will be upgraded, it will be maintained. Allowing a Dunoon ferry to use that link span as well would involve very little additional costs. But the Scottish Government's failure to follow the Council's lead and reconsider the harbour charges is a great disincentive to getting a vehicle ferry service back. Again, I asked Paul Wheelhouse about that and got the usual vague, well, we'll think about it. We have to make them do more than think about it. We have to make the Scottish Government act. We need to ask the Scottish Government to do two things. Firstly, publish a tender for an operator to carry passengers between Dunoon and Burgh on 40-metre vessels, with the operator having the discretion to carry vehicles as well. Secondly, introduce fair harbour charges at Burgh. Any operator, and that includes CalMac, Western Ferries, would be entitled to bid. Now, plenty of taxpayers' money has been spent on consultants, on ministerial visits, on replacement bus services. If they would only take expert advice and build new 40-metre boats, then none of those expenses would be needed. Now, DG FAG has been making this case very ably for 7 years now. It's not their fault there are deaf ears in Edinburgh, because DG FAG have done a good job. They've tried their best. What we need to come out from this meeting is a loud, clear message to the Scottish Government. We demand safe, reliable 40-metre vessels now. Write, phone, email your local MSP, your regional MSPs, make appointments to see them, write to the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse at Holyrood. We have to get the message across that this community deserves safe, reliable 40-metre vessels. Now, whether you want a vehicle service, a vehicle passenger service, or only a passenger service, whichever you want, you still need a 40-metre vessel for reliability. So let's get the message across. Send a message to the Minister and MSPs. We demand safe, reliable 40-metre boats now.
That was Alan Reid, loud and clear, ex-Liberal MP and standing as candidate as a Liberal for the Holyrood. And he was emphasising, obviously, reliability and the need now for 40-metre minimum vessels. So it's now back to John Patterson, who's in the chair.
Thank you, Alan. We now hear from Donald Cameron. He's a Conservative List MSP.
Thank you, panel. Thank you, Susanna and the committee. I'm an MSP for the Highlands and Islands, and I've got a particular interest in Argyll and Bute, given that I was a candidate here in 2016. And it's great to see that two of my fellow candidates have just spoken before me, Alan and Mick, and it's a reunion, but it's a rather depressing reunion, if I'm being honest. Because the last time I was at a public meeting with Alan and Mick, and I'm sure many people here in the room, was at Hustings during that election. And many of the issues about the ferries came up at that Hustings. And it is incredibly depressing that 3 years on, nothing has changed. And that, for me, is an indictment, actually, on the Scottish Government and what's happened. I should say that's 3 years, but we heard references earlier back to the 1980s. This is not just a matter of years, it's a matter of decades that people here in Dunoon have had to put up with this, and that is appalling in my view. And I would just reiterate what both Alan and Mick said, that this isn't about party politics. This is about serving this community. And we all feel the same way, and we all feel very strongly about that. Now, I'm not a resident of Dunoon. I'm from further up the west coast. But I totally understand the frustration people feel. The last time I came over here about a month ago, I was on a cancelled ferry. I missed the bus to the Western Ferries terminal. I had to get a taxi. It cost me money, and then I got over, then had trouble getting back. This was a problem for me on one day. But there are people here who need to attend hospital appointments. There are people here who are studying over the Clyde. There are people here who are working, who rely on it. And we must achieve a robust, reliable service. Representing the Highlands and Islands is quite interesting for me in this regard, in that you get to see ferry provision generally, and there's been reference to the Northern Isles, there's been reference to the Western Isles, and there is a wider context here, because the ferries across the west coast of Scotland are hugely popular. There's a problem of overcapacity, if I'm being honest. There are even passenger overcapacity in terms of the Western Isles. But there's also a very sad result of years of underinvestment. In 2010, CalMac was told that it had to build a new ferry every year to keep its fleet up to date. And it hasn't. And the fleet is getting old. It is getting, it needs maintenance. And there is a real issue with our ferry policy nationally and in terms of the investment we should have been making. And the sad thing for Dunoon, I think, is that now that CalMac has formally taken over the ferry, that you will experience that again and again. I'd like to briefly say that obviously I represent the Highlands and Islands at Holyrood. I've had many surgeries here. I've met the group when they've come to Holyrood. I will do everything I can. Write to me and I will take action. I will agitate for you on your behalf on this issue. I've done it. I've had submitted lots of written questions to the Minister, and I've asked questions orally in Parliament. We had a debate about ferries. I've mentioned Gurrit Dunoon. We need to keep the profile of this issue right up there in the government's mind. So we do not let up. We do not let up for an instant in harrying the Scottish Government, as others have said, to ensure that we continue to press for a better service. And I will do all I can, and I'm sure others will too, if you please get in touch with me. Now, I just wanted to say, obviously Paul Wheelhouse came over and spoke to you, and he's obviously made promises. Well, promises have been made to you before, but he did say, and I think that it's right that he did promise 2 new vessels, and he's also said that the service will remain a passenger-only service. Now, the harsh reality is that I don't see the government stepping back from that. And I was interested to hear what I think John was saying about the sort of the stubbornness of the officials in returning again and again to the fact that it was to be a passenger-only service. I think we need to press them on a number of things. I think we need to press them on the investments that they'll make to the infrastructure, what improvements they will make there. I think the issue about RET is incredibly important, because will the Scottish Government apply RET to this route now that it is being operated by CalMac, and that it is currently, I think, the only route that does not have RET? I think we need to absolutely keep that one in the crosshairs. So, as I've said before about the passenger service, my fear is that this is where the Scottish Government is going. From all that I've heard, it's sadly very familiar. The attitude of the Minister, etc., is what I hear when I ask questions in Holyrood. And I think what we need to ensure, that if that is the case, that we ensure that this service receives adequate investment and meets your needs as a community, and we achieve the robust, reliable service that you don't just deserve, you rely on. It is a lifeline. It is an absolute lifeline. We talk about lifeline services. This is a lifeline. There are people who don't have cars. There are people who require a town centre to town centre service. That's the vision that I think all of us share. I don't think this is a party political. I'm not here to score party political points. I've seen members from all parties here tonight. And only by working together, can we achieve what we require, and a robust, reliable service that everyone, and is safe, clearly, that everyone can use. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Susanna, and thank you to the panel. That
was Donald Cameron, Conservative MSP. And he made some excellent points there, especially regarding cancellations of the ferry late at night and you're stranded, and that we don't have RET here at all. The only route in Scotland not having a road equivalent transfer, tariff, get it right. So I'll be back to the chairman, and that is John there in the chair.
And then continuing this cross-party arrangement, Dave McEwen-Hill can't be with us tonight because, as you might suspect, he's through in Edinburgh for the SNP conference, but he has provided a statement, and it will be read by Ken.
I'm sorry I cannot be with you all tonight. When I agreed to say a few words, I didn't understand that I would be at Edinburgh at the time of the meeting, nor, for some clarification, did I expect to be featured as an official SNP spokesperson on this matter. I speak in a personal capacity, but I do represent the views of much of the local SNP membership on this issue. The process of destroying the commuter link to Dunoon has been going on for years. To put on boats unsuitable for crossing, then use that as a reason to suggest the route is not popular or sensible is an insult to our community intelligence. I have no doubt that the effort is, and always has been, deliberate to destroy the route. It was designed to fail. Of that I have no doubt. I was heavily involved in the original campaign, and deceits and distortions were exposed on a number of occasions. I don't believe anything has changed. It looks very much to me that a succession of hard-pressed transport ministers have been fed inaccurate or incomplete facts about this crossing and the service options. The continuous suggestion that there is some EU impediment to a vehicle carrying service is untrue, and has to be challenged and publicly killed off. We keep hearing that a vehicle carrying service is not achievable. It is never explained why this is apparently so, and it is essential that this is explained fully and publicly. Why Dunoon alone, of all the ferry services across Scotland, should be thought unworthy of public subsidy, though with vehicles on it wouldn't need a subsidy, when this is not an issue anywhere else, should be explained. In my opinion, if all else fails, a public inquiry into this essentially corrupt procession should be contemplated, though that would be very expensive and required significant fundraising. David McEwen-Hill.
That was David McEwen-Hill there, and his statement was being read by Ken Barr. Dave is a real Kent figure in Dunoon and a stalwart SNP supporter, and there's no doubt that he says there's been deceit and inaccuracy and bad advice given to the SNP government ministers. That was David McEwen-Hill. The next back to the chair, and the chairman will be calling out another speaker. It should be, I think it's back to the audience he's going to do now. He's going to call people from the audience.
You just say the name.
Is it on? Okay, thank you. Michael Breslin's my name. Thank you for letting me speak. I need about 4 minutes, and I hope I can get that. I've been a member of DG FAG since it started. And in the early 80s, I was also involved in the fight to stop the then Tory UK government, which wanted to close down the town centre route altogether. That wasn't what was said from the platform, but that was their starting point. To do that, they wanted to give Western Ferries a subsidy to take passengers. It was me who put the agreed alternative to Malcolm Rifkind, which was to give that same subsidy to Calmac and to allow the vehicle service to continue unsubsidised. That compromise was the basis of the service until 2011. But as a regular user, I can tell you it was underused. That was then, and this is now. And I have changed my mind because the facts have changed. The economic damage has been done, but it will continue unless we change tack. Let me briefly explain what I mean and why I've changed my mind. We've been at this campaign since 2011 and we've made no progress, not a jot. In the early part of this year, off my own back, I decided to renew contact with one of the interested ferry companies when there was supposed to be a tender. I met them face to face and they told me that they had done the numbers on running a vehicle service and that it was far too risky. Their view was that the numbers were so stark, nobody would have risked it. The capital costs were also very high. They are, though, still interested in supplying new passenger ferries. Since 2011, Western Ferries has done what any sensible person would have done, and that's greatly increase and improve their capacity. Very soon they'll have 4 new link spans, 2 each side. This makes it much, much harder for any competitor because of their potential for much increased frequency. I know people who commute regularly from Burgh to Glasgow, and one of them regularly picks someone up at Langbank coming from Burgh. That journey from Burgh to Langbank now takes at peak times 50 minutes. 50 minutes. And that's before you get to the congestion in Glasgow. And I think it's fair to say congestion is only likely to get worse. Public transport is the future, not cars. If the Dunoon project takes off, as I sincerely hope it does, we want to encourage people to come here on public transport, not to create major parking issues for us in Dunoon. A major threat is Western Ferries wanting to resurrect what they had in the early 80s, which is their ferry bus proposal. I heard it at first hand from Gordon Ross in Dunoon last month. This would be disastrous. It would add 45% in time to the minimum journey time between Dunoon and Glasgow. 45%. Nobody, least of all commuters, would find that acceptable. But the danger is it would offer the government a much cheaper fix, so we need to be very, very wary. There's been much mentioned here tonight of the 40-metre length. It's Codswallop. And it's Codswallop because Corrywisk is 65 metres and regularly cannot cope with the wind conditions on the Clyde. So, it's not just all about length, it's not just all about weight, it's about suitability and design of the vessel. My last point about why I've changed my mind is that the government, despite what I think are clearly incorrect figures in the Audit Scotland report, will be under pressure from them to do something about the increasing costs of subsidy in this route. The numbers are declining. They are particularly poor on the mid-service, namely the one that doesn't meet the fast train, the 20 past 8 hour service from Dunoon. There's almost nobody travels on it. You need to understand that. That can't continue. So my view now is that the best bet by far is for DG FAG to change tack and support a high-speed passenger service that would give a 15-minute journey time. Transport Scotland now has a proposal on the table. It was given to them last week to provide 2 new vessels, and the timescale is 12 months, not 36. So let's change tack and get behind this. Thank you.
That was Mike Breslin, a member of the audience, making some very interesting comments.
If you want to have a high-speed ferry link, go ahead. First of all,
this is
get
Robert
Clydeport
Travis.
Double the speed limit. Come back in 2 or 3 years' time once you've achieved that, and then look at a high-speed ferry. I've been in contact with them. There's a 12-knot speed limit which they're enforcing at the moment.
12 knots at the moment.
Right.
12
Look, can you hear me?
Yes.
I won't take 4 minutes, Michael.
This is Professor
I have to say I
Neil
disagree
Kay,
with
Professor of Economics.
A problem tonight, I think, is I give due credit, in fact, a lot of credit to DG FAG, the work they've done individually and also as a group. But we're going over all the history. What we should be doing is focusing on what is the problem. And there's one key problem. Every time you go back and say that you want a vehicle carrying ferry, the government will say there's been no interest. Now, as Mick knows, that's not the case. We know one ferry company who was very interested and, in fact, would have made a commitment had they been able to purchase Gourock Terminal, which was never going to happen. However, here's the problem. It's got 2 aspects. Firstly, there's a high harbour charges, as Alan said. But a fundamental other aspect of the problem is time horizon. If you're going to build a new ferry commercially, you're going to be looking at 25, 30 years life of that ferry. That's the time horizon that's required. So we can't expect Gourock Terminal or indeed Dunoon to be sold, but there are solutions in the other part of the world. A good example was Whitelink. Whitelink had a deal 3 years ago with Portsmouth Council in which they agreed a 41-year lease for the facilities at Portsmouth. And that gave Whitelink the time horizon it needed. We probably wouldn't need a 41-year lease, but a long-term lease that allows the risks and the capital investment that the company will have to make will give the security and the confidence to invest in new vessels. Now, the problems lie in Gourock. That's where they lie at the moment. There's also the issue here in Dunoon. But I think we all agree the Council's shown more flexibility in the past. And if we can crack the issue of getting this Gourock problem solved, then I'm pretty sure that the Council would come in as part of a package deal. So you've got to define the problem. It's a long time horizon is required, and the need to give a commercial operator the confidence with which to invest for the long term. That, together with the harbour charges, which should be solved in any leasing agreement. Thanks, Nick.
Dunoon Community Radio, brought to you by the Observer Stationery and Craft Shop, 219 Argyle Street, Dunoon, at the traffic lights.
For over 60 years, Gleaner Oils have been providing a quality service from local depots throughout Scotland. We pride ourselves in knowing what our customers want of us and are equally proud in providing what is expected of us. Across the rural countryside, through villages and towns, and regardless of the weather, we will not let you down. Gleaner Oils and Fuels. Telephone free on 0800 833 534.
Right, that was Neil Kay, Professor Neil Kay, a well-known and international terminology of one of the great economists in the world. And he was obviously saying there are risks and investments, and the charges at Gourock are one of the main difficulties. And he obviously had disagreed with Mike Breslin there. He's now, I think, gets supported by... It gets supported by whom? It gets supported by Alan Reid, who represents the council. Come on, Alan. Let's hear you. Oh, he's disappeared. Right, so on we go then. And give you some more information. Alan Reid responded to the Argyll and Bute Council by saying that Neil Kay was correct, that there was a leasing agreement, and Argyll and Bute Council is extremely sympathetic. And that was on the line that Professor Kay was speaking. And coming up now will be the roving Mike going to get Ronnie Smith from the floor, and he's a general advisor to Dunoon Gourock Ferry Action Group.
Smith, and I'm an advisor to the Ferry Group. A couple of points which have been made but perhaps ought to be underlined. One of these is the fact that regardless of what Michael Breslin said, it is the experts who actually have decided on 40 metres as being a critical length. I don't think it's something that people who are not experts, who do not have particular knowledge of the subject, should question, whether they happen to be ordinary members of the public like myself and Mike, or whether they happen to be government ministers. The fact is 40 metres is essential. But there are two other points. First, the question of the economics of operating a vehicle and passenger service. Now, this has been examined again by experts. The first time was the Deloitte Touche report. Now, Deloitte Touche, as you probably know, are one of the 4 largest accountancy firms in the world, employed by management, by government, and by all sorts of large organisations to give them advice as well as to perform ordinary accountancy services. They found that it would be perfectly possible to run a profitable section covering vehicles not requiring subsidy. The practice, as you know, with the streakers proved that. Then we had the MVA report, which again emphasised that profitability. Now, one of the problems, as has already been touched on, is the harbour charge structure. Now, to give an example of this, in the MVA report, there were tables calculating the effects. In the circumstances, the most likely circumstances, a vehicle carrying service operating between Dunoon and Gourock, on the harbour charges concerned, would pay 63% of its turnover in harbour charges. Now, can you imagine a shop which paid 63% of its total year's sales to its landlord for rent, because that's the equivalent? You wouldn't get many people taking the shop. Now, the fact is that the harbour costs, ignoring the fact what's actually charged, the harbour costs don't alter very much between having a small vessel, like the Alley Cat, berthing there, and having a large vessel, and having a large vessel with cars. The actual costs of operating the port do not greatly vary in those circumstances. So the effect is that there is a deterrent to commercial operation. At the same time, the harbour at Burgh is actually losing money by about £1 million a year on the present setup. So the type of solution that Argyll and Bute have put into effect would save money for Seamal at Burgh and would also make it much more attractive to operate a ferry service with vehicles. So that's the second point. The third point is that the audit report itself is in some ways not acceptable. The Martin Dorchester figures are one example, but we also have the question that the reporters, the actual audit team, were advised by a team of advisors. Now, that's fair enough. I would emphasise these were not people who were giving evidence. They were people who were advising. The team was interesting. It included two of the civil servants from the Transport Department, one of whom was named tonight. They included, and I'm sure he would be totally disinterested in the result, Mr. Gordon Ross, Managing Director of Western Ferries. They also included a Mr. Rod Peterson, who wrote a book entitled Western Ferries Taking on Giants. So it was with that advice to help them that the audit team produced their report. And afterwards, there were civil service discussions, which we obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, which showed transport officials almost hammering the minister to remove the service altogether. And I think those facts have to be borne in mind. I think it's clear from all that's been said that Dunoon's survival and prosperity depends on getting 40-metre vessels. Let us all campaign to do so. Thank you, everyone.
That was Ronnie Smith, who's an accountant and economic advisor as well to Dunoon Guruk Ferry Action Group. And he did point out that Deloitte Touche and MVA were paid for by the government to give them advice, and they did give them advice, and the advice has not been taken. Plus the fact he raised the question, and it is a question, was there a serious conflict of interest, as you probably heard in his paragraphs there. So, next up will be a businessman from Dunoon who's had his business here for about 50 years through his father and himself. He also, I think, had businesses in Campbelltown, and that will be Alan Livingston, and you'll hear him in a moment.
Hi, my name's Alan Livingston, Highland Stores. Our family's been in business here in shopkeeping 50 years this year, which I'm pleased to say we're still here. I think that the thing for me, I came tonight and I was involved in peer pressure way back at the turn of 2000, and they've done very well trying their best, DFAG, etc., to do what they can, but as the lady just said and others have said, we just don't seem to be getting anywhere. I think I have had some dealings with Mike Russell, and I have to say on a sort of personal nature to do with my family, he was very good. However, on this occasion, in this situation, he is most definitely not helping at all. And I find it, and I know it's on the radio, so if you're listening, Mike, just listen by all means, which is that, I am not at all happy that he is not here tonight to listen to the views of the local people and to answer them. Whether he agrees or disagrees is fine, but he needs to be here. And he, as a minister, he always has the ear of the First Minister, and if they want to make things happen, they can, as we know, as has already been said about other things. So I think I would suggest at this point that maybe we put a lot more pressure on Mike Russell to attend meetings, to be here, and maybe organise one saying, if you don't come to it, the people of Dunoon are going to come and we're going to sit there until you do arrive. And maybe it'll be reported on the fact that he hasn't bothered to come. So maybe that we need to up the ante locally with him, because I haven't really heard or anybody say a good answer from him as to what his view is, other than I don't think we need a vehicle ferry. But he doesn't seem to have any other answers, so it might be a way forward. Thank you.
That was Alan Livingston, local businessman for many a long year in Dunoon, and giving his opinion. I dare say that Mike Russell was at the SNP conference that weekend and couldn't manage to come to the public meeting. But it was a public meeting. It was well advertised. And there were, as you heard, lots of opinions coming in thick and fast. The next one up is another member of the audience. And I believe her name was Mary Fryer, who is a regular commuter and traveller using the ferries.
Mary Fryer-Stevens. Not so much a question as a statement. I'm surprised nobody tonight has mentioned the end of the 907 because I work for a FTSE 100 company. We have offices in London and Glasgow. I use the sleeper regularly to go down to London. I'm in Glasgow probably once a week. Now, I used the 907 because it literally took me into Bothwell Street, which is where our office is. So now that that's gone, again without consultation, they didn't reduce the service, they just axed it. I have to look for an alternative to get me into the centre of Glasgow. And quite frankly, the bathtubs just don't do it. So, you know, from my point of view, being able to use public transport to get to the centre of Glasgow, I don't have a viable option at the moment. And I'm kind of mixing and matching, sometimes driving, getting, if it's a nice day. But I mean, I've had nice days in Glasgow and I've got to Burgh and there's nothing. And quite frankly, it's getting to the point where I'm seriously considering I'm going to have to buy a smaller property on the other side because we're getting stranded, because it just can't happen. And, you know, I appreciate probably not everybody here is still of working age, but I think it seriously stymies people who live here, who are of working age, and don't necessarily work for local companies, but work for large companies who obviously pay very decent salaries and also bring a lot of money into the area. And I think that's a real problem.
Thank you very much. And may I say that your experience, madam, is exactly what's been happening here, because people, we all know, that people have moved away from this area simply because they can no longer commute. And I say that as a former commuter who travelled for 25 years, and only one day I couldn't get to my work. There's absolutely no way I could cope with the service that commuters are expected to cope with now. And it's having such a detrimental effect on Dunoon.
Evening all, Neil Alexander, member of the Dunoon Ferry Action Group. I ended meeting the Paul Wheelhouse just last week, and I ended by saying this, and he must have known this. There was a survey 2 years ago, ladies and gentlemen, which placed Dunoon and Campbelltown as bottom of the league for the most vulnerable small towns in Scotland. That was 2 years ago. I reckon, as I said to Paul Wheelhouse, who kept smiling at me, by the way, and I did say to him, you should be actually greeting, you should actually be crying tears, not smiling at me. Kept smiling at me. Nice chap, by the way, nice Scottish sonsy face, but he didn't seem to realise that we are now at the bottom of the league as the most vulnerable small town in Scotland. And that is the fault of the current government. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, back to the chairperson. I think he does a little summing up before we all departed from a very, very busy Dunoon Borough Hall. Reckoned about 100 people in on a Friday night in Dunoon at 7:30, and it was payday. I thought it was a remarkable number for such a small town. I don't know what it would be equivalent to in a place like Glasgow or Paisley or Edinburgh even, but it was a big turnout. And as you heard, lots of opinions, lots of strong opinions there, and really the whole thing about the ferries is a complete and utter scandal. It's been a scandal since 2010/11, and the Dunoon Ferry Action Group did go to Parliament about 3 years ago, and I was standing very closely to Nicola Sturgeon, and who, in her very clear, bell-like voice at times, but she was only 2-3 feet away from me, said very clearly that the policy of my government is to have a safe, regular passenger and vehicle ferry service from town centre to town centre. And then she added another phrase, and this is an important phrase, because the current situation, she said, the status quo in Dunoon is simply not an option. Now, that was 3 years ago, ladies and gentlemen. And she built, I mean, really, if you think of the Oscar ceremonies, I would have handed her an Oscar saying, for sheer sincerity, the winner of the Oscar and the person who believes in helping local communities survive is Nicola Sturgeon. But so far, we have been disappointed. But now she's First Minister, she probably doesn't have the time. It's left to the Ministers for Transport, although they're not called that now. They've got a much bigger term. Paul Wheelhouse is called the Minister for Energy, Connectivity and the Islands. And I put in brackets, Transport. And so far, of course, he's just not long in the job, but we hear that other ministers, and there have been 5 of them. If you remember the one with a similar name to me, Alexander Neil, Alex Neil said very clearly, less than a year after the new Argyll ferries came to service, which we were told were world-beating service. They were then called the bathtubs, and he said they are not fit for purpose. And that, by the way, has also been echoed by Nicola Sturgeon. So why not? Because regular ferries with vehicles and passengers would make a profit, because the previous ones, Carl Mack, called the Streakers, made quite a considerable profit and were regular. And as John, the chairman there, John Patterson, said when he travelled regularly, they lost just 1 day in the last 5 years of their service before they were dismissed, and we got the bathtubs. That's why Dunoon is in despair and extremely, and I mean that, extremely angry.
Dunoon Community Radio, brought to you by the Observer Stationery and Craft Shop, 219 Argyll Street, Dunoon, at the traffic lights.
For over 60 years, Gleaner Oils have been providing a quality service from local depots throughout Scotland. We pride ourselves in knowing what our customers want of us and are equally proud in providing what is expected of us. Across the rural countryside, through villages and towns, and regardless of the weather, we will not let you down. Gleaner Oils and Fuels. Telephone free on 0800 833 534.
All right, we're back to what's next, and it'll be John Patterson in the chair saying what the Dunoon Guruk Ferry Action Group Committee hopes to do soon and next.
Now, before we conclude, and I hand over to Susanna, I think we should say what we are going to do next. Mick has already alluded to taking on Audit Scotland, and we will, as I told Mr. Wheelhouse, we will vigorously pursue these figures of 13 million and 30 million. We are going to be demanding, and I hope you will support us, that we demand RET to be introduced on the route as quickly as possible, and at the latest, the winter timetable. And we also should demand that there be a reduction in the charges at Guruk and the service be put out to tender. Because if the charges were reduced at Guruk, then there would be, without doubt, an interest in running the route. Now I'm going to hand over to Susanna.
Susanna, who's suffering very badly from a bad throat here, and you'll hear her. We had a special mic here to get her voice carried to. By the way, the Borough Hall's quite a big hall, you know. It's and it's a kind of B-listed building. I don't know if it is B-listed, but it's a very old building, and it's been all redeveloped by the great architect who's behind it all, McCausland. So it's over to Susanna in a second or two.
Hello. I was at a meeting before this wonderful committee was formed to fight valiantly on our behalf to get what we need. But I'm absolutely appalled that it's gone on so long and they've got, shall we say, nowhere. There's been lots of other problems going on in Westminster, for instance, which nobody wants to talk about, including me, which have made lots of us challenge whether democracy is going to the wall. And I think a lot of people here feel too, it's not as crowded here as it was that first meeting. People think if people like you can't get there, will it ever happen? Is it worth giving up their evening for? And that's a shame, a terrible shame. The other thing I was going to say was, long, long ago, when the Romans were around, they used to have senatorial meetings discussing this and that. And they had one rather famous gentleman who used to address them called Cicero. And he always said, cui bono, which basically means, who's the one who profits from this? I think we should try and find out.
There you are, ladies and gentlemen. Not only a big audience, but a very erudite audience as well. Intellectuals are here in Dunoon. Cui bono, eh? Cicero. So who benefits from all of this? That's a good question. We've had questions raised about conflict of interest. We've got questions raised about advice to the government. We've got questions raised by, as I said, a Will Kent figure about the fact that the whole thing is made to fail, and therefore if it fails, they're not surprised because they've already got it done to do that. So you've had a lot of questions being asked there, as well as some very good facts. Facts are chills that dinna ding, and quite a lot of them were there, like the fall in the population, like the 43% down in the school population, like the famous school up the road there, Dunoon Grammar School, that gave you people like, wonderful people like the late John Smith, who would have been Prime Minister of the United Kingdom if it hadn't been for his untimely death. And you have people like John Robertson, now Lord Robertson. You've got people like Brian Wilson, all coming out of that school, whose population has fallen in just over 10 years. Just over 10 years. From what? From over 1,000 and roughly 70 pupils down to just over 500 plus pupils. Nearly a fall of 46-47%. Dunoon can't go on like this. The once pearl of the River Clyde, the jewel in the crown, has now gone down to the bottom of the most vulnerable league. And it's all happened during the terms of the SNP. And honestly, we were so hopeful and so delighted to think that at least we'd have people in power who actually believed in us and believed in communities, and we've been treated like rubbish. It's an absolute disgrace and a total scandal. And the sooner they get this sorted, the better. But we've had 7 to 9 years of this, by the way. This all started in 2010/11. What are we now? 2019. It's hard to remember the dates. I think it's absolutely shocking. And that's why I said earlier, the town is in despair and the town is deeply, deeply angry. Thank you very much. This is Dunoon Community Radio 97.4 FM, and this is part of the wee programmes we have called Just Talking.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I just simply bring the proceedings to a close by thanking you all very sincerely for coming out here tonight and showing your continued interest. And I can confirm that we are going to continue to fight for something that is entirely justified. I think I've said at previous meetings that all of us on the committee, apart from young Robert here, are retired. We could easily sit back with our reduced rate tickets and say everything's fine for us. But we passionately care about this community. We are despairing about what has happened to our town because of the result of a totally inadequate ferry service. And so the fight must go on, and we intend to continue that fight until we get justice and a proper ferry service. As has been said already this evening and in the letter we submitted last week, we pay taxes too. We are entitled entitled to a proper ferry service. Thank you and good night.
Dunoon Community Radio, brought to you by the Observer Stationery and Craft Shop, 219 Argyle Street, Dunoon, at the traffic lights.
Aloha. As we leave the sun-drenched shores of Glasgow behind, we see the children leaping up and down with their hands in the air. Are they happy? No. They've got broken bottles stuck in the soles of their feet. Clyde Coast landladies are looking bored. The absence of tourists has got them floored. The question they're asking would make you swoon. Why don't they come back to Dunoon? Why this swinging resort, this switched on scene, has 3 pubs, 2 cafes and a fag machine, and hills you can walk up while the rain is running down. Why don't they come back to Dunoon? Long time ago, people would flow in, even from overseas. But in recent years, the only ones on the piers have been seagulls and a few CND. At this point in the song, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to remind you of a competition held in the Glasgow newspapers, where the first prize was a week in Dunoon and the second prize was a fortnight in Dunoon. They can't understand it or hear them roar. We've got Yanks here and fairies by the score, and a nightlife that stops in the afternoon. Why don't they come back to Dunoon?
Sailing down the Clyde on the Waverley, a grand old boat is the Waverley. She'll take you down to Rossi and be back for tea, the way that you did when you and me. The buskers played at the after end, the kind of tunes that won the trend. You're always sure to meet a friend before you leave the quay. sailing in the Clyde on the Waverley. A grand old boat is the Waverley. She'll take you down to Rossi and be back for tea, the way that you did when you were wee.